neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Reconstruction was the reorganization and reestablishment of the seceded states in the Union after the American Civil War. There were two acts that were passed by Congress in 1867. The first act is known as Military Reconstruction Act and divided the southern states into 5 districts, each governed by a Union general. Congress sent military to the South to keep peace and protect the freedom. The southern states needed to rewrite their constitutions so that they did not include slavery, and also ratify the 14th Amendment allowing slaves to be free. The Second Reconstruction Act placed Union troops in charge of voter registration, and Johnson tried to veto them twice because he was a slave owner. The daily lives didn't change for blacks and poor whites, and while Congress tried to pass moral laws, they were disregarded by the South. The newly formed Southern government made public schools that were segregated and did not receive enough funding. Unfortunately, their literacy rates never improved. There were many race riots in Memphis and New Orleans in 1866, which is why the Union found it necessary to send troops to the secessionist states. The people who kept passing the acts in Congress were called the Radical Republicans and wanted the South to conform to the Northern mindset politically. By 1870, all the states had been readmitted into the Union.
In essence, to keep the nation as a whole, America had to come to a promise that all men were created equal, and thereby slavery should be abolished altogether. The 13th Amendment was ratified December 6, 1865, and was a major victory for the North, and the Northerners hoped that when coupled with the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery would be illegal, both morally and constitutionally. The South was enraged by the amendment and thus tried to manipulate the law using it to their advantage. Though the blacks were free, and Southern legislatures had to remove slavery from their constitution, the 13th Amendment set the stage for the Black Codes. It was evident after the Civil War to the slaves that white Southern plantation owners would go the distance to keep their slaves, even if it meant bending the law. Southerners were anxious to regain power over them and used the law in order to achieve that objective. In 1865, Southerners created black codes, which served as a way to inhibit the freedom of ex-slaves. Codes controlled almost all aspects of life and prohibited African Americans from the freedom that had been won. It was through the creation of the Black Codes that whites discovered that they could control almost all aspects of life of Southern blacks. The codes encompassed some of the previous restrictions on free blacks, Northern apprenticeship laws, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the War Department regulations. Codes regulated civil and legal rights such as marriage, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, occupational choice, and the right to hold and sell property. Laws were different in each state, but most embodied the same kinds of restrictions. Common amongst them, codes compelled freedmen to work. In many states, if unemployed, blacks faced the potential of being arrested. Many of those that did work had their day regulated. Codes dictated their hours of labor, duties, and often assigned to them as agricultural workers or domestics. Black codes left African Americans with little freedom. Even the freedom to choose an occupation was often regulated. This regulation guaranteed a workforce. Self-sufficiency was also discouraged. Codes prevented African Americans from raising their own crops. Almost every aspect of life was regulated, including the freedom to roam. Many codes prohibited blacks from entering towns without permission. Residency within towns and cities was also discouraged. Residency was only possible if a white employer agreed to take responsibility for his employees' conduct. The creators of the codes did not try to hide the obvious bias and prejudice. In 1866, black codes were suspended by federal officials after they determined that the codes were too harsh. They believed that blacks should be subject to the same penalties and regulations as whites. Although these early codes were put to an end, new codes that were less harsh were put into law by several state legislatures after 1866.
The 14th Amendment was designed to ensure that all former slaves were granted automatic United States citizenship, and they would have all the rights and privileges as any other citizen. It was ratified on July 9, 1868. It was initiated in opposition to the Black Codes to make sure that the slaves were to be treated fairly and equally, as well as to protect the rights of native-born Black Americans, whose rights were being denied as recently freed slaves. It was written in a manner so as to prevent state governments from ever denying citizenship to black-born in the United States. But in 1868, the United States had no formal immigration policy, and the authors therefore saw no need to address immigration explicitly in the amendment. Other groups tried to use the 14th Amendment to further their causes. Women attempted to use it to proclaim their right to vote, and African Americans tried to use it as well. By directly mentioning the role of the states, the 14th Amendment greatly expanded the protection of the civil rights to all Americans and is cited in more legal processes than in any other amendment.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 15th Amendment was designed to close the last loophole in the establishment of civil rights for the freed slaves. Unfortunately, it was ineffective because the Southerners found ways to intimidate the blacks so that they wouldn't vote. The 15th Amendment was the last of the Reconstruction amendments to be adopted. Previously, the states had had full responsibility for determining voter qualifications. It did provide the vote to blacks living in the northern states, and it did encourage voting by blacks in the South for a period of time. However, Southern whites still found ways to harass and intimidate the blacks so that they wouldn't vote. This amendment duly impacted the women's rights movement in that it inspired them to pursue their suffrage with more vigor, as the 15th Amendment put women below the state status of slaves.